He barged into a classified FBI meeting, slapped the cuffs on me like I was the criminal, and then froze literally when a Black Hawk helicopter descended right outside our house. That's the moment everything unraveled in the family. The silence and the secret have been guarded for years. If you've ever wondered what it costs to do the right thing when your enemy wears your last name, this is that story. It was early September when Eli Walker returned to Fairfax, Virginia. The air was still heavy with the last traces of summer, but the leaves had begun their quiet transition, fitting, Eli thought, for a man like him who lived in transitions, who moved in silence. He stepped out of his black SUV and stared at the two-story colonial house where he grew up. It looked exactly the same, except nothing was. Margaret, his mother, greeted him with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Her hug was warm but hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she was embracing a guest or a stranger. "It's good to have you back, Eli," she said. "Just for a while." Eli replied, his tone even practiced. He wasn't lying. His DC apartment had suffered from a minor fire due to faulty wiring, and while repairs were underway, this house in Fairfax was the most convenient and the most complicated option. Inside, the walls were adorned with family photos, most of which featured his older brother, Jack. Jack the hero, Jack the first responder. Jack, who never left Fairfax. Eli's photos were fewer, tucked in corners as if added out of obligation. Jack Walker arrived a few hours later. He didn't knock. He never did. "Back under the family roof, huh?" Jack said, his voice dipped in something halfway between sarcasm and curiosity. "Temporary," Eli said, setting down a secured briefcase on the kitchen table. They shook hands briefly. Jack's grip was firm, dominant. Eli didn't resist. There had been a time when they were close, when backyard football games turned into long conversations about dreams and futures. That time had disappeared somewhere in their 20s, buried beneath job titles and unsaid words. Jack had become a sergeant at the Fairfax Police Department, decorated, respected, the kind of man who made headlines in the local paper. Eli, by contrast, had taken a quieter path. While his title at the FBI sounded impressive, few people, even family, knew what he actually did. That ambiguity was a problem for someone like Jack. "So they have you working from here?" Jack asked, eyeing the black case. "Remotely. It's secure," Eli replied, his tone neutral. Margaret, sensing the tension, offered coffee. No one accepted. Dinner was even quieter. Jack talked about the city, about changes in the department. Margaret nodded, asking surface-level questions. Eli mostly listened. He didn't speak unless spoken to, and even then his answers were efficient, like he'd been trained to give just enough. That night in his childhood room, Eli unpacked his equipment: encrypted laptops, communication tools, access tokens. He worked from a hardened system with firewalls and endpoint isolation. Every move was logged, every access monitored. His work wasn't just secure, it was invisible. But he couldn't ignore it, the feeling of being watched. Not from cameras or satellites, but from eyes just down the hall. Jack's eyes. Eli had seen the way his brother looked at him during dinner. Not just curiosity, suspicion. A need to understand, but also a need to be proven right. The next morning, Jack stood outside the house in his uniform, coffee in hand. "You always did like secrets," he said. Eli paused. "Only the necessary ones." Jack studied him, then turned and left for work. No goodbyes, just the low rumble of a patrol car pulling out of the driveway. Back inside, Margaret was folding laundry. She looked up. "Jack's just protective. He means well." Eli nodded. He didn't correct her. What was the point? Later that night, as he logged into a secure terminal to analyze a data breach from a cyber criminal cell in Eastern Europe, Eli reflected on the unspoken chasm between him and his brother. He could navigate firewalls and decode encrypted channels, but he couldn't decrypt Jack. Still, he sensed something was coming. Not from the hackers in Bucharest or the fishing rings in Lagos, but from this very house. From Jack. And Eli knew one thing for certain. Home was never the safest place. In the stillness of late night, as the world outside Eli's window dimmed under a veil of suburban quiet, memories crept in. Uninvited, persistent. Fairfax had that effect. The walls of his childhood room echoed with sounds long past the squeak of sneakers on the porch. The thud of Jack's boots as he stormed down the hallway, the faint hum of his father's favorite jazz station. But it wasn't nostalgia that gripped Eli. It was something more, brittle reminders of a hierarchy that had always placed Jack first. Growing up, Jack Walker was the definition of all-American boyhood. Athletic, confident, the one who hit home runs and got straight A's without breaking a sweat. At school events, Margaret was always in the front row clapping the loudest. Their father, a former Marine turned mechanic, had a proud glint in his eye whenever Jack walked by in uniform, even if it was just a Boy Scout sash. Eli, in contrast, was quieter, thoughtful. He asked questions no one wanted to answer and preferred books to balls. Where Jack commanded a room, Eli disappeared into it. Margaret often said Eli was sensitive, a word that landed like a sigh rather than a compliment. Their father didn't understand Eli. He valued strength, volume, presence, and Eli was none of those things. Once, after Eli had skipped a school dance to work on a science project, their father had muttered, "Boys your age should be out chasing girls, not hiding behind a microscope." The divide between the brothers wasn't created in a moment. It was layered year after year through dinners where Jack's stories dominated the table, through holidays where Eli's achievements were footnotes to Jack's triumphs. Margaret never meant to play favorites, but the house made it clear who the center of gravity was. The wedge between them became a wall after their father died. The funeral was silent agony. Jack took over organizing, greeting mourners, standing tall in his uniform. Eli stayed mostly in the background, helping quietly with logistics, retreating when the grief became too loud. Margaret had clung to Jack even more after that, depending on his presence, his decisiveness. She needed someone strong, and in her eyes, Eli was too gentle to carry that weight. Jack began to refer to Eli not just as the little brother, but the soft one. It was never said cruelly, not outright, but it lingered on his tongue and his expressions, in the way he'd ruffle Eli's hair even into their 20s, like Eli hadn't grown at all. But Eli had grown, not upward into the loud world Jack inhabited, but inward into nuance, ethics, quiet strategy. While Jack saw confrontation as strength, Eli believed in restraint. While Jack kicked down doors, Eli opened them with codes. Eli's choice to join the FBI had baffled Jack. "Desk job," Jack had scoffed years ago when Eli mentioned it. "You're wasting your brains behind a screen." What Jack didn't know, what he never tried to know, was that Eli had saved lives, stopped cyber attacks, tracked digital trails leading to human trafficking rings. But Eli never advertised his impact. He didn't need applause. Even now, as adults under one roof again, that old dynamic reasserted itself like a reflex. Jack would come home from work and talk about an arrest, a chase, a badge of courage. Margaret would listen enraptured. Eli would sip his tea, nodding occasionally, unseen. Sometimes Eli wondered what it would feel like to be the son who brought pride effortlessly. But those thoughts dissolved when he returned to his work, the digital battlefield where silence meant strength, where anonymity protected not just himself but thousands. One evening, while walking through the neighborhood to clear his mind, Eli passed the old schoolyard. The rusted swing set, the cracked basketball court, they stood like relics of a time when everything seemed simpler. or perhaps just less visible. He remembered a time when he fell off that swing, bloodied his knee, and Margaret ran straight to Jack, who had merely stubbed a toe. Not because she didn't care, but because she noticed Jack first. Eli learned early not to cry. Not because it was weak, but because it went unheard. Back at the house, he opened an encrypted email, a new directive from FBI Internal Affairs. They were deepening an investigation into leaks from local law enforcement. Fairfax was now on the radar. Eli's pulse quickened. He knew what this meant, and yet he felt no joy. The past had already written a blueprint for how Jack would react if he ever felt cornered. Eli knew that blueprint by heart. In that moment, Eli realized the full shape of the burden he carried, not just as an agent, but as a son, a brother, and a ghost of the boy who once wanted to be seen. He closed his laptop, staring into the dark. Some echoes never fade, they just grow quieter until you carry them inside you forever. It began with glances too quick to be accusatory, too frequent to be benign. Jack had never trusted ambiguity, and Eli embodied it. To a man trained to identify threats through posture, tone, and timing, Eli was an enigma. And Jack hated puzzles he couldn't solve. Jack started noticing the oddities Eli's devices more than any man working from home should reasonably need. Laptops with heavy casing, biometric scanners, drives that auto-encrypted on disconnect. He didn't say anything at first, just watched. Eli kept odd hours, sometimes up past 3 a.m., eyes lit not by insomnia but purpose. Jack would wake up and hear the soft clack of keystrokes, the occasional hum of a VPN tunnel engaging. Once he found a discarded post-it in the trash, no words, just a hand-drawn cipher key. That was when he stopped ignoring it. He bought a camera, small, discreet, designed for baby monitors and cheating spouses. Jack justified it as protection. If something happened in that house, he needed to know. He installed it in the hallway near the vent angled toward Eli's door, just enough to catch movement, not enough to be incriminating. At least that's what he told himself. For days he monitored passively. He saw Eli pacing, heard the soft rise and fall of phone calls in languages Jack couldn't place. Saw data cables, portable SSDs, packets of burner SIMs. Jack had seen enough on the job to recognize red flags, and Eli was waving them. One afternoon, Jack walked into the kitchen to see Eli closing a file folder, a thick one marked with a red tab and foreign script. Their eyes met. Eli smiled. A flicker, nothing more. "Something interesting?" Jack asked, feigning casual. "Work," Eli said. "You know how it is." But Jack didn't. Not Eli's kind of work, and that ignorance gnawed at him. That night, Eli opened his laptop and stared at the terminal. He had known about the camera since the first day, noticed the lens angle, the subtle whine when it activated. But rather than confront Jack, he welcomed it, fed it. He began leaving bait, half-coded scripts, fragments of conversation about server breaches, handwritten notes in Cyrillic. He encrypted personal files but made sure a few unimportant ones were accessible. A setup, a digital honeypot with one target, Jack. In his secure logs, Eli monitored the IP pings, packet sniffing, and attempted decryption. It all pointed to one origin, one curious cop trying to save the family by investigating the wrong enemy. Meanwhile, in D.C., Internal Affairs from the FBI had looped Eli into a wider net, an operation involving intelligence leaks possibly connected to local law enforcement. Fairfax had pinged on their radar more than once. Jack didn't know that by watching Eli, he had become part of something larger. Eli submitted his weekly report. Within it, anonymized logs of access attempts, behavioral summaries, metadata, all neatly packaged in bureaucratic armor. One day, Margaret found Jack staring at the family computer. "You're looking for trouble," she said quietly. "I'm making sure we're not already in it. Jack replied. But even he didn't know what he hoped to find anymore. Later that night, Eli left a flash drive on the coffee table. A decoy. It contained nothing but fragments of open-source tools and a script that looped the words, "Trust is not surveillance. It's choice." Jack found it, plugged it in, watched the script run. The next morning, he didn't bring it up, but something in his demeanor had shifted. More watchful, less accusatory, like he was waiting for Eli to confirm what he feared or deny what he hoped. That night, Eli got a secure call. "Target confirmed," the voice on the other end said. "Escalation authorized." He didn't smile, didn't frown, just closed the lid of his laptop and whispered to no one, "Let the watcher be watched." It came in quietly, like most dangerous things do. A letter unsigned routed through a third-party privacy service in Alexandria disguised as a routine personnel complaint. The document was thin on facts but heavy in tone. The suggestion was that Eli Walker, special agent with the FBI's Cyber Operations Division, had forged his credentials and was operating illegally. No direct evidence, no fingerprints, no name. But Eli didn't need a name. He could smell the author in every line, Jack. Protocol required internal affairs to act, not because they believed the complaint, but because bureaucracy didn't have the luxury of hunches. At Quantico, Eli was called into a secure room. Neutral walls, white noise generators, 2 agents with folders. No threats, no accusations. Just an invitation to talk. Delaney, the senior IA agent, cut through the formalities. "Walker, we believe this report is a smokescreen, possibly intended to divert us, but it gave us something unexpected. It confirmed a pattern." "What kind of pattern?" Eli asked, though he already knew. Delaney slid over a tablet. "Cross-reference of data leaks traced to state-level law enforcement. One node lights up consistently. Fairfax." The breach wasn't a single moment, it was a slow drip. Over 6 months, small packets of data from internal coordination memos, field team locations, surveillance targets, all passed through a Fairfax PD channel. Most of it seemed harmless until aggregated. Eli leaned back. "You're saying Jack is the source?" Delaney shook her head. "We're saying his credentials were used. Whether knowingly or not, that's what we need to determine." Eli didn't flinch. "Then let me help." From inside. IA agreed. They set up a dual-channel system. Eli would continue his post in Fairfax while feeding IA encrypted behavioral logs, metadata captures, and audit trails. A ghost operation. Clean. Silent. Back home, the mood hadn't shifted. Jack was colder, less confrontational, but sharper in his glances. Margaret floated between them, too distracted by her garden and her grief to notice the psychological trench forming in her home. Each night Eli worked, not just on his federal assignments, but on decoding Jack's digital exhaust. Emails, access logs, private message timestamps. It wasn't surveillance, it was containment. Then came the breaking point. A forwarded PDF from Jack's department email to a personal account. It contained a seemingly generic field report, but buried in its metadata was an attached string and IP address connected to a known intermediary for whistleblower sites. A secondary header carried a journalist's ID tag. Eli flagged it, cross-checked. The same journalist had published 2 recent leaks, one on ICE operations, the other on FBI miscommunications with local PDs. Both minor embarrassments. But sourced from Fairfax, Jack didn't mean to betray anyone. That's what Eli believed. His brother was prideful, eager to prove he still mattered. Maybe he thought leaking would earn influence or simply feel powerful in a system that had long stopped praising him. The irony was sharp. Jack had tried to accuse Eli of impersonation while impersonating influence himself. When Delaney called with confirmation he's the access point, the pattern is clear. Eli didn't respond immediately. He walked outside, stood beneath the motion sensor porch light, and watched a moth circle the bulb until it burned out. The next morning, Jack knocked on his door, a rare gesture. "You got a minute?" Eli nodded. Jack stepped inside, stared at the desk, the laptop, the flash drives. "Look if something's going on." "I didn't mean to make things harder." Eli didn't answer. Jack's voice cracked. "I just didn't understand why you're so quiet, why you never explain anything." Eli looked at him. Not angry, just tired. Because some truths don't survive the noise. Jack left without another word. That night, Eli submitted his full report. The digital threads were now a web. The investigation would proceed to containment. And still Eli said nothing. Because sometimes silence was the sharpest knife, the most honest mirror, the only way left to protect those who wouldn't protect themselves. The war wasn't loud, but it was real. And Eli. He'd been fighting it long before Jack ever noticed. It was supposed to be another ordinary night. Margaret had gone to bed early, humming a hymn from her childhood. The house was silent save for the low hum of Eli's encrypted equipment tucked inside his bedroom. On the second floor in the dimmed study, 4 agents from FBI Internal Affairs sat in a makeshift war room. It wasn't official protocol to meet off-site, but with the leaks growing bolder and with Eli's unique position, this house had become the eye of a quiet storm. A map of breach points illuminated the wall. Diagrams of connection tree, strings of access logs. The agents spoke in clipped, deliberate tones, acronyms, codenames, references buried in 5 layers of clearance. Eli stood by, listening, analyzing, coordinating in real time. Every move Jack had made, every unauthorized transmission had been mapped, time-stamped, and quietly buried in internal evidence vaults. The tension in the room was silent but tangible. Eli's laptop screen pulsed with incoming data. Logs parsed themselves into real-time summaries. The entire operation had been running seamlessly for days. Everyone knew something would break eventually, but none of them expected it would break that night, and not like this. Then came the crash. A door slammed. Heavy boots pounded up the staircase. Voices rose. Jack burst into the room. He held up a printed document, screenshots of Eli's logs cobbled together in haste and paranoia. His eyes were bloodshot, his posture twitchy with adrenaline. "This isn't protocol," he shouted. "You're not who you say you are. I have proof. I want to see his device, now." The agents froze mid-sentence. Chairs scraped backward. Delaney, calm as frost, rose from her chair. "Sergeant Walker, you're not cleared for this environment. You need to leave." Jack shook his head violently. "You don't understand. He's been hiding things. I know what I saw. His laptop, it's tracking government activity and—" A loud beep cut through the room. Eli's laptop flashed red. Unauthorized access detected. Honeypot triggered. In an instant, every keystroke Jack had made, every file he attempted to open was logged. A backup file auto-encrypted and streamed to a remote FBI node. IA's secure servers lit up. Red flags, alerts, risk index escalation. Delaney didn't move. She looked at Jack with a calm pity. "Congratulations," she said. "You just triggered the entirety of a national counterintelligence protocol." Jack froze. The color drained from his face. The document in his hand trembled. His breath hitched. Eli stepped forward, voice quiet but cutting. "You didn't trust me, so you tried to force clarity through chaos. You came into a war room like it was a bar fight." Jack's shoulders dropped. He looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time. I thought you were hiding something." "I was," Eli said. "But not what you think. I wasn't hiding a crime, I was hiding a threat. From you. From all of this. The other agents stood up now. Delaney gave a subtle nod. Jack's access credentials would be suspended. A review panel would be convened. The consequences would be administrative for now, but far-reaching. Jack looked back one last time. At Eli. At the little brother he never quite understood. The weight in his gaze wasn't just guilt, it was recognition finally of the divide neither of them could ever fully cross. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jack asked. Eli didn't answer. Instead, he turned to the wall screen, tapped a key, and shut the system down. "Because if I had," he whispered, "you wouldn't have believed me." Outside, the wind picked up. Trees rustled like murmured regrets. In the distance, a low helicopter hum echoed overhead, standard protocol when federal security was breached. Lights flickered across the lawn. Inside, the agents began packing up. Margaret still slept downstairs, unaware her house had become a node in a national network of trust and betrayal. The files, the logs, the backup copies, they'd now be analyzed, processed, cataloged. But the real damage had already happened. Eli sat back down. He didn't look at Jack again. Because in this world, sometimes the people who love you most are the ones who can't see you at all. And in silence, the system reset itself. One war ending, another already starting. 10 minutes passed like centuries. The FBI agents in the room stood at partial attention, their hands twitching near concealed holsters, not from fear but preparation. Delaney was on her encrypted phone, whispering confirmation codes and operation phrases into a line that linked directly to a federal command unit in D.C. Outside, the neighborhood remained quiet, bathed in the dim golden hue of porch lights and television flickers. It was a suburb like any other, except tonight, it wasn't. At precisely 2:37 a.m., a distant mechanical roar cracked through the air. The house trembled subtly first. The window panes, then the floor beneath Eli's feet. Jack, still standing by the door, looked toward the sound. His eyes narrowed. The agents didn't react. They were expecting it. Within 30 seconds, the Black Hawk appeared low, silent, matte black, its rotor blades slicing the air like a scalpel. It hovered above the cul-de-sac before descending slowly onto the street, its spotlights turned off until the final 5 feet. Margaret woke up to the vibration. The glass on her nightstand danced. She shuffled to the window in her robe, blinking into the night. The moment she saw the helicopter, her hand shot to her chest. By the time the landing skids touched asphalt, 4 federal agents had stepped out of the house and down the front steps. A second tactical team emerged from the helicopter, coordinated, unhurried. They carried no weapons drawn. The power was in their precision. Delaney approached the team leader, exchanged brief nods, and then turned back toward the house. Jack had not moved. Eli remained behind the others, watching silently. "Jack Walker," Delaney said, projecting clearly but not shouting. "You are under federal investigation for unauthorized access to classified systems, violation of Tier 3 security protocols, and obstruction of an active counterintelligence operation." Jack blinked, mouth open. Margaret was now on the staircase, one hand on the railing. "What's going on? What are you doing to my son?" Delaney's tone softened only slightly. "Ma'am, please stay back." 2 agents flanked Jack. He didn't resist. His limbs were slow, almost robotic. When they turned him around and pulled his arms behind his back, he flinched, not from pain but from disbelief. The handcuffs clicked. Margaret gasped. Jack stood there, eyes wide. His breath caught in his throat as he looked across the room to Eli, who stood still as a statue, his hands by his side. Jack's voice barely made it out. "You really did this to me?" Eli met his gaze. "You did it to yourself." Outside, the helicopter's engines pulsed rhythmically. Neighbors were beginning to wake, peering through Bleen's recording on phones. The spectacle was cinematic, but it was real. It was the end of one chapter in the Walker household and the beginning of another no one had dared imagine. As Jack was led down the front steps in cuffs, Margaret stumbled forward. "Please, he's a good man. He's a police officer. He served this town." Delaney interrupted gently but firmly. "Ma'am, he compromised federal security. We'll take care of him. You should speak with your other son." Margaret turned to Eli, her expression unreadable. He had no defense to offer her, only the truth, and it was too heavy to hold in that moment. Jack was loaded into the helicopter. The door shut with a thud. Within seconds, the Black Hawk rose again, disappearing into the night sky as swiftly as it had arrived. The silence afterward was deafening. Margaret looked at Eli. Was any of this necessary? Eli whispered, "Not as an agent, but as a son. More than you'll ever know." Then he sat on the porch, the cold wood beneath him, a reminder that no victory in war comes without loss. And in that quiet moment, Eli understood something clearly for the first time: to protect the truth, sometimes you must sacrifice the story everyone else wants to believe. In the days that followed, the world spun on, oblivious to the seismic shift that had taken place in a single quiet house in Fairfax. Cable news anchors moved to the next scandal. Algorithms served up new outrage. No one knocked on Eli Walker's door. No journalists camped out on the lawn. There were no questions to answer because officially there had never been a question. The footage of the Black Hawk's landing circulated for a few hours in obscure corners of the internet. Reddit threads, encrypted message boards, TikTok speculations. But without names, without context, the story faded. Just another strange night in America. Eli disappeared into the fold. By request, he transferred out of the cyber operations front lines and into a secluded analytics post deep inside a federal facility outside Washington, D.C. His badge still worked. His clearance remained intact. But his world had shrunk to a few screens, a handful of numbers, and the endless, methodical quiet of intelligence parsing. The FBI offered him commendations, a discreet award, career advancement. He declined it all. His only condition was silence. Margaret stayed in Fairfax, clinging to routines. She woke at 6, brewed coffee for 2, watered the garden Eli once detested mowing. The old rhythms remained, but the air was heavier. The silence she'd once taken for peace now echoed with questions. She left voicemails, made soft apologies. When Eli picked up, they spoke in code about flowers, the weather, small things. She didn't know how to ask the real question. He didn't know how to answer it. Some evenings she'd wander into his old room and sit on the edge of the bed. She never cried. That had stopped the night the helicopter took Jack. Since then, her grief had matured into something quieter, more enduring. Eli buried himself in work. He watched numbers scroll, tracked anomalies, caught patterns that no algorithm could. He was efficient, precise, haunted. There was no glory in the truth he uncovered, only silence. And silence, when nurtured long enough, becomes pain. He tried to tell himself it was worth it, that the quiet was noble, that justice was a cold comfort but a necessary one. But he couldn't shake the hollowness. One night, a memo landed in his inbox, an invitation to a trauma processing group. Confidential, voluntary. He almost ignored it. Then he opened the link. It was a beige room in a federal building. A circle of chairs, no name tags, no agenda, just a space to speak. They talked about betrayal, about the guilt of surviving when others didn't, about the isolation of being the one who made the right choice when everyone else wished you hadn't. When Eli finally spoke, it felt like stepping into sunlight after years underground. "My brother wasn't evil," he said, "just blind and proud And I think he hated how much he needed to be the hero. So when he wasn't, he made me the villain. And I let him. Because he was family. He paused, and because part of me still wanted his approval even as I was dismantling everything he'd built. No one interrupted, no one judged. In that stillness, Eli breathed deeper than he had in months. When he left the session, he didn't go straight home. He walked the city for hours, letting the night fold around him, letting the guilt become just one note in the symphony of his past. Back in Fairfax, Margaret began attending therapy. Not because anyone told her to, but because she realized she couldn't repair what she never understood. She wrote Eli a letter, not to be mailed, just written. In it, she confessed that for years, she'd measured strength by volume, who was louder, who took charge, who saved the day. She realized too late that silence wasn't weakness, sometimes it was sacrifice. Eli never read the letter, but somehow he felt its absence. They spoke more, gradually. They laughed once or twice. Forgiveness wasn't a thunderclap, it was a gentle thaw. One evening, Margaret asked, "Do you think Jack ever understood?" Eli paused. "No, but I think he knew I loved him, even if he couldn't name it." She nodded. "And me." "You were trying," Eli said. "That counts for something." Weeks passed. Eli stayed in the background of the world. That suited him. He was no longer trying to be understood, he was trying to live. And the silence. It still lingered. But now it made space for healing, for nuance, for peace. And that finally didn't hurt. A full month had passed since the night the Black Hawk touched down in their quiet cul-de-sac. In that time, Eli had neither spoken to Jack nor mentioned him to anyone. He had heard through federal updates and Margaret's careful slips that Jack had been placed on temporary suspension pending a psychological evaluation, and was now residing at a recovery facility operated by a federal rehabilitation program for law enforcement officers. Eli debated whether he should go. He wondered what he would say, if anything. What apology might sound like from a man who never lied but always withheld. What forgiveness could mean from a man who had done everything by the book and still lost his brother in the process. Guilt had started to gnaw at him in quiet moments, especially in the dead of night when the hum of machinery no longer distracted his conscience. On a quiet Sunday, Eli got in his car and drove the 40 minutes to the facility. He wore civilian clothes. No badge, no symbol of what had happened. Just jeans and a dark sweater, as plain as the man he had become. The drive felt longer than it was filled with imagined dialogues that always ended in silence. The facility was tucked behind a grove of elms, the signage discreet, the grounds well-maintained. Everything about it exuded softness, a sharp contrast to the edges Eli had lived by. The receptionist recognized his name and gave a solemn nod, guiding him to a small common room at the end of a long hallway. It was lined with windows, peaceful, the kind of place where broken people came to relearn how to be human. Jack was already there. He sat in an armchair, eyes on the trees outside, hands folded in his lap. He looked older, thinner, quieter. The fire that had once defined him now smoldered behind his eyes. His posture lacked the pride he always carried, and for once his uniform wasn't there to give him shape. Eli entered. Jack didn't turn. They didn't speak. Eli sat down across from him, not close enough to invade, not far enough to retreat. The silence stretched. A full minute, maybe more. In that moment, it wasn't just the space between them that felt heavy. It was everything that had come before. Then Jack turned his head just slightly, just enough to meet his brother's eyes. No anger, no resentment, just a tired understanding. Eli nodded once. Jack nodded back. That was it. Not a word was exchanged. There was no need. Everything they might have said had been screamed, written in reports. scrawled in the space between their lives. The accusations, the heartbreak, the unspoken wishes for a different outcome, all of it hung in the air like old smoke. Now only silence remained, and yet in that silence something changed. Not healed, not forgiven, but seen. Two men who had grown up believing they had to fight to be right had finally found a moment where neither needed to win. It wasn't resolution, it was recognition. Eli stood first. Jack didn't try to stop him. He watched, eyes unreadable. As he walked to the door, Eli paused. His fingers brushed the frame. He didn't look back, but his voice, low, steady, carried across the room. "Take care of yourself." Jack closed his eyes, nodded once more. "I will." Eli stepped into the hallway, the door whispering closed behind him. The air outside the facility was cool and smelled faintly of pine. Eli took a deep breath, letting it fill the hollowness he hadn't realized was still inside him. For the first time in weeks, his chest felt less constricted. There were no resolutions, no grand reconciliations. But something softer had been born, a seed of something that might one day grow into peace. A shared silence, and sometimes that was enough to start again. Later that evening, Eli sat on his apartment balcony watching the city exhale into dusk. He sipped lukewarm coffee and didn't mind the bitter taste. It grounded him. He thought about Jack, not the officer, not the rival, but the boy they both once were. The one who protected him on the playground, the one who pulled him out of the river when he fell in, the one who taught him how to ride a bike. Eli smiled faintly. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a beginning. Months passed, seasons shifted. Time softened the sharp edges of memory. In the stillness that followed chaos, Eli Walker found something he hadn't anticipated: room to breathe. He had stayed out of the public eye since the operation that changed everything. The press never learned the full story. The FBI never released the details. For most, it was just another classified moment buried under bureaucracy. But for Eli, it was personal history etched into every step he took. So when the offer came, a quiet request from the Office of Internal Affairs to serve as a federal security advisor, he didn't answer immediately. The role meant returning to a familiar place, Fairfax Police Department. The very building where Jack once wore a badge and commanded respect. It also meant occupying a space once defined by tension, by secrets, by betrayal. But Eli wasn't running anymore, and the invitation, while unexpected, came with purpose. He accepted. The office was modest, tucked on the second floor overlooking the parking lot. Each morning, Eli walked past old photographs of departmental milestones. Jack's face appeared in several. No one mentioned it. But Eli noticed. His work was quiet but foundational: revamping cyber threat protocols, rewriting whistleblower protections, mentoring internal affairs agents on how to detect silent fractures before they became fault lines. His focus wasn't vengeance, it was prevention. He moved like a man on a mission, but not one fueled by pain. Something more enduring: accountability, responsibility, healing, though he would never call it that. One day, his supervisor, a sharp-eyed woman named Renee, stopped by his office. She'd read his internal training proposal titled, "The Ethics of Silence: Navigating Integrity in Institutional Systems." "You ever think about saying this out loud?" she asked, tapping the document. To a wider audience, he hesitated. "Not really my arena." She smirked. "Maybe it should be." A month later, Eli stood under the red circle of TEDx Arlington lights, dimmed, audience hushed. He wore no script, just a blue shirt, dark jeans, and a calm that came from knowing he had survived the worst version of himself. He began with a story not about espionage, but about silence. about the space between right and wrong, about what it costs to do the right thing when the system around you begs you to shut up. He didn't name Jack. He didn't need to. He spoke of betrayal not as a dramatic rupture, but as a slow erosion of trust, of loyalty as a burden, not just a badge, of the loneliness of moral clarity. For years, he said, I believed silence was safety, that if I just stayed small enough, good enough, obedient enough, I wouldn't have to choose between justice and family. I was wrong. Silence is not safety. Sometimes silence is betrayal. His words landed like stones in water, rippling, unavoidable. The video was uploaded 3 days later. Within a week, it hit 1 million views. Within a month, it had been translated into 8 languages. Social media found him. Articles called him the quiet firebrand of institutional reform. Podcasts reached out. Universities quoted him. Former whistleblowers thanked him in direct messages filled with tears and truth. He answered none of them publicly, but privately he wrote back to those who wrote from the heart. One message stood out from a retired Marine Corps captain. You said what I couldn't 20 years ago. I buried brothers and kept my mouth shut. You gave my silence a name. Thank you. In time, Fairfax PD unofficially adopted portions of Eli's protocols. Other departments followed. The FBI cited his training model in a federal ethics review. His name, once entangled in suspicion, now stood for something else: resilience, precision, quiet transformation. Margaret watched the TEDx talk from her living room. She didn't cry. She just whispered, "That's my son." Even Jack, still under psychological observation, saw the video. No one knows what he felt, but according to the nurse, he requested a printout of Eli's quote. Justice isn't the loudest voice. Sometimes it's the one still speaking after the shouting stops. Eli kept going, not chasing fame, just following the thread of truth. It took him to policy panels, to training summits, to the heart of federal ethics reform. He never spoke of Jack, but those who listened carefully heard him there, in the pauses, in the ache beneath the words. He had become something rare, a man who didn't need noise to be heard, and in doing so, Eli Walker didn't just reclaim his name, he redefined it, not with vengeance, but with vision, with integrity, with the kind of strength that doesn't need applause to endure, the kind of strength that survives. And sometimes that's the loudest truth of all. The morning light slanted gently across Eli Walker's desk, casting long shadows over a polished plaque that bore his title, Eli Walker, Federal Advisor. It had been almost a year since everything changed. The Black Hawk incident, Jack's arrest, and the unfolding of a truth that lived far beneath surface-level loyalties. But time, as it does, softened the trauma. It did not erase it, but it layered it with meaning, with reflection. In the past months, Eli had grown into his new role, not as a warrior, not as a whistleblower, but as a quiet sentinel. He helped restructure how interagency intelligence flagged insider threats. He mentored junior investigators not just in techniques but in ethics. He became known in internal circles as the one who could be trusted to hear what wasn't said. One ordinary Wednesday, an envelope arrived, no markings but a familiar script. It was his mother's handwriting. Eli stared at it for a long time. They hadn't spoken much since the incident. Margaret had visited Jack a few times, once breaking down in the hallway of the facility, murmuring, "I raised them to protect each other, not this." He opened the envelope. The seal cracked softly. Inside was a letter handwritten in ink that smudged slightly as though written with trembling hands. "My dear sons, I've lived long enough to know that truth is not always immediate. It doesn't scream, it whispers. And for too long I listened only to the voices that shouted. I thought strength looked like certainty, like badges and medals. I see now that strength can also be silent. It can weep in solitude. It can stand its ground without demanding applause. Eli, when you stood still and let the storm rage around you, when you chose the harder path because it was right, I finally understood. I used to ask God why I couldn't see clearly between my two boys. Now I know the answer. I wasn't ready to understand your silence, but now I am, and I am proud. Love, Mom. Eli read it twice, then he folded it neatly and placed it beneath the corner of his desk blotter just under the edge of the nameplate. He stared at his name carved in metal and wondered if legacy could change not by loud victories, but by silent endurance. He sat back in his chair, eyes drifting to the window. The view overlooked the back of the precinct where an old helipad still bore faded marks. It was the very spot the Black Hawk had once landed. That day had changed everything, but it hadn't broken him, not truly. In recent months, Eli had begun speaking privately to officers from other departments off the record over coffee in quiet offices or shadowed corners of ethics summits. They came not for lectures, but for something closer to absolution. How do you keep going, one had asked. He didn't have a script, only a truth. You don't chase the world's approval, he told them. You just make sure your silence is never mistaken for complicity. He reached into the drawer and pulled out a small framed photo, one of him and Jack as boys, arms slung over each other's shoulders, gap-toothed smiles wide with summer. That innocence had long vanished. But something else had grown in its place. Not bitterness, not triumph, something simpler. Understanding. He turned the photo to face the window as if letting it see the same view he did now. He stood, walked to the glass and looked down. There were new recruits being led in formation below, young, uncertain, eager. He watched them silently, his own journey reflected in their posture, their questions. Then almost inaudibly he whispered, some stories don't need to be told aloud, they just need to be lived. And as he returned to his desk, he knew one thing with certainty: his story, painful as it had been, had become someone else's survival guide. Because sometimes legacy isn't carved in stone. Sometimes it's written in letters, whispered through generations, lived quietly and with honor. And for Eli Walker, that was enough.